Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Words number 27 with Dani or Emily, or Dani and Emily, depending on whose channel you view this on, or whatever. Anyway, and we are just going to hop right in. We did not pre-show other than to discuss the blurriness of Dani's eyes today. that was all we talked about.
And how pretty Emily looks today.
There we go. Yes, Dani's finished with ballet, and it's time to start. So today we're going to do something a little bit different than we normally do. We're going to be experimenting over the next couple of weeks and months with some different ideas because we've had some good suggestions from people. So there may be guests, although so far nobody's biting. Right? Dani and I have both done a good enough job at offending people in the political and social commentary sphere that maybe we're, maybe we'll be shit out of luck with that one, but that's okay. We can talk about the experiences of trying to make that happen, and that will be interesting. But today we're going to do something a little different, and we have a couple topics we're going to get to, but I think, so we're going to talk a little bit about the incredible hypocrisy of Bari Weiss. We're going to talk, I'm going to give a little teaser about sort of a theory I'm developing on the Weinstein brothers. We're going to talk about the definition of the word mandate, because people don't seem to understand what that word actually means, right?
You looked that up, by the way?
I did, and I feel like it's very murky, and I feel like this might be one of the different definitions that has been altered in the public, publicly available definition providers over the last year. But
I'm looking up the etymology right now, but yeah. Can continue with your glorious intro.
What we're going to start with, and I think the main thing today is going to be, we're going to sort of, in a different way than most people review films, we're going to review the new Netflix documentary Athlete A, which discusses the Larry Nassar issue and the USA Gymnastics issue, but mostly through the lens of an athlete that most people in the public arena aren't familiar with, and her name is Maggie Nichols, and how when people hear about this story, they've heard about Jamie Dancher, and they've heard about Michaela Maroney and Simone Biles and Allie Raceman, but this whole process really started with a beautiful gymnast named Maggie Nichols, who in many more ways than one really suffered for not being for both her and her family not being part of the hive mind of the sick culture of USA Gymnastics. And there's some interesting things throughout that film. So we're going to give kind of a review and some of our thoughts on that film. And with the hope or the idea in mind, possibly, that there's a person that maybe we think might be willing to have, maybe I think, it's my intention that a person that might be willing to, not Maggie Nichols, but a person who's in the film may be the avenue in to have an intellectual conversation about what the gymnastics community may be missing in how the Larry Nassar case connects to the larger issue of pedophilia in our country and in the world. So I watched it a few weeks back. Of course, I'm a lot more familiar with all the ins and outs of these cases and stuff because I've paid closer attention. I watched it a few weeks back. I watched a little bit more. Oh my God, did I leave my notes out there? Hold on, I might have to go grab my notes. I made notes, which I never do. Let me see. Do I have my notes? I'm gonna go get my notes. I'm gonna hit pause for 1 second.
Okay, I'm gonna do the same.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry guys, it's such a rarity that I take notes before the show that I'd forgotten that I'd done it and forgot to bring them in. So I watched a little bit more again this morning because I watched it a few weeks back. And I got about 20 or 30 minutes in, and I already had so many notes. I'm like, I'm going to stop, otherwise it's just going to get too in depth. But I would like to hear, because you haven't paid as close attention to this, and you just watched the movie the other day. What did you think of this documentary?
I thought it was really well done.
Mm-hmm.
It was way better than I thought it was going to be. I also didn't realize the extent. I didn't realize that there were over 500 different complaints against Larry Nassar. The things that stuck out to me the most were how the head of USA Gymnastics was just, at least as far as the documentary went, kind of let off the hook. I mean, they did track it as much as possible, but for me, that was the big dangling question mark. Why was this allowed to happen? And the other piece that struck me the most, just, as far as my own personal experience as a gymnast, was hearing that beautiful Olympian woman, I think her name was Jamie
Dancher?
Yes. Talking about the abuse and the extent of how much we didn't like our coaches and how mean they were to us. And I really forgot. I think I blocked out that whole piece And I wanted that to be built out a little bit more. I felt like it would have helped. I mean, they did a great job and they had so much material, but that whole culture of abuse and control, it just, you know, triggered a lot in me of my memories. And I felt like the story would have been well served with a little bit more of an explanation of how gymnasts are abused and controlled beyond just the sex stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. So I'd say that in that film, Jamie Dancher and then Jennifer Say, who is also the producer of the film and the person that I am hopeful that we may be able to at some point have a conversation. I think she has the intellect to understand what we're talking about. And also she stepped out and started complaining about these issues in USA Gymnastics long before it was hip to do so. She wrote a book more than 10 years ago about her experience as an elite gymnast, and people blacklisted her basically for what she said. And she was alone for all those years. And then finally people came around to this, and she is the producer of the film. It was like, okay, she kind of conceived of telling the story from this perspective and then found a documentary team to help her. She's a very successful, she's extremely intelligent. She's a Stanford graduate. She's incredibly successful in the business world, but she also seems to have the balls to be willing to separate from the popular opinion a little bit, even when she's at times been at the front of that. I mean, this was someone who was a USA champion in gymnastics and had a very successful career. And for her to then, this isn't somebody who like sucked and failed and then complained. You know what I mean? So she doesn't seem afraid. And I was listening to her interviewed on the gymnastics podcast about this, the film, and it was just a few weeks ago. So they were also discussing a little bit about social issues because she lives in San Francisco and there were fireworks going off constantly in the back, like was happening for a while. And what I've noticed is a lot of the gymnastics community has jumped on to all the social bandwagon bullshit. And while she was very measured in her comments about it, right? I think she came from a very centered perspective. They got into a conversation about some social issues around racism. And she really more pointed to, we all know there's an issue. I have two of her children are Black, and she went into some experiences, but she didn't generalize that to this other thing like, come on, wake up guys, everybody's racist. You know what I mean? She was more nuanced in her description of the social issues. And I think she's been fairly nuanced in her description and the way she portrayed what she thinks the problem is in this documentary. And I think that this third rail that you and I are talking about that, you know, that we're going to get into is just either something that my guess would be that she's not aware of. And if she was made aware of it, then maybe her intellect could help us even to fill in some of the blanks of, you know, the blanks.
Yeah, it was interesting in that, like, I understood why you wanted me to watch it, and I could see the glaring hole, and I could see how everything was pointing to, this is the elephant in the room, why aren't we addressing it? And another piece that I feel called to mention before we dive into what you want to talk about is this sort of American notion of ambition and striving for excellence and what it requires. Mm-hmm. And just the extent of psychological abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse that we put these young girls through to be champions, and how much, and I do think it's something wonderful about American culture, our innovation and the striving for excellence. And I also think it invites us into a larger conversation of at what cost.
Absolutely. And that's actually been her point in all of her media appearances really around this. And so I thought that was interesting. The other thing I wanted to say for people who this is the first time you're hearing us really talk about this other than in offhand remarks, I did an interview with Robert on his show about 2.5 years ago when this story really just broke. And to date, I still think it might be the best thing I've ever done. I think it was probably my best presentation of information or whatnot. So people can go back. I'll link to it down below. And that lays out a lot of different details. Some things will cross over with what we're talking about today because I was already seeing where this was going back then. But I will recommend that people, and Robert and I have done a couple of other shows where we tangentially talked about issues we've noticed with this case. But where I wanted to kind of jump in here is, so this athlete A is Maggie Nichols. She was the first person to officially make a complaint about Larry Nassar. And first of all, I recommend everybody go watch this. It's on Netflix. And you know, it just came out the last week of June, so it still should be towards the top of things and easy to find. So Maggie Nichols is a gymnast. She was on the U.S. national team for many years, including a second place finish at the 2015 World Championships. She's also been one of the most successful gymnasts in collegiate gymnastics since retiring from elite gymnastics. She competed for University of Oklahoma, had her career cut short by COVID, ending her senior season. So I don't know that she'll be back for a 5th year as a senior, but she did win, I think, 2 NC2A all-around national titles as well. She's a beautiful gymnast, but she is not a household name. And when you watch this movie, you'll maybe begin to understand why. And it's kind of interesting. So she was not, both her parents and her coach, I would say, were somehow not part of this sort of hive mind that's been created in the culture of like USA gymnastics, particularly at the elite level, where, you know, like the Steve Penny, who is the president of USA Gymnastics, and the Carolis and coaches are just gods, and we just don't question anything they say, right? Her parents, and her coach was actually the one who first reported it, right? And, you know, and her coach, you know, like, yeah, her coach, you know, this has been going on for years and years and years. It went on in our gym, it went on, and we saw, you don't even have to know, you knew which coaches and which photographers and which trainers were creepy. Like this is something also to have a conversation about, I think, at some point, is like, we all knew it. It was no secret, but like, we didn't have a language for it, or we didn't understand how to express it. It was just something we seemed to sort of accept as part of the culture. And that's terrifying in and of itself. But that
was really terrifying. I just want to acknowledge that. Like, it wasn't until watching this movie that I realized, God, that was such a horrible, dangerous, dysfunctional situation that was so normalized. We didn't question it. And the fact that, you know, Fritz hit us and was so abusive, like, made him a great coach.
right.
This really shifted my perspective
And there was always these like gym parents that sat there all day and watched, right? And instead of being alarmed when you or I were yelled at, or somebody was smacked, or, you know, aggressively handled or whatever, instead of being alarmed by that, they were just proud when their daughter didn't. Look at my little girl. Look, Fritz just loves her, and da-da-da-da, right? Like, it's this crazy, it's like a mental illness, like some kind of mental parasite that overtakes people, you know, and it's very similar to the Hollywood parent kind of thing. Her family when you look at them be interviewed, they seem like normal people that have normal concerns. What are you talking about? He did a procedure on my daughter where he had his fingers in her vagina. You know what I mean? Like, what? You know what I mean? And they were pretty persistent in pursuing this. They were not going away. And as you watch this, you know, it's kind of laid out length, you know, without ever directly saying this over the course of the movie. But, you know, there's this idea being hinted at, and it's been part of a discussion since the film came out in the gymnastics community, was Maggie Nichols intentionally kept off the Olympic team because of the fact that she and her family were making a stink about this, and they weren't just going to let it go. And I would say the answer—
Is that even a question? It was so obvious. It was so obvious that was exactly why she was kept off the Olympic team and destroyed her career that she worked so hard for.
Yeah, so I think because of the timing of her injury, it gave them a plausible out. But when you look at her condition, her overall physical condition and performance in the months leading up to the Olympics, and compare that to someone like Gabby Douglas, who they had decided long ahead of time that they wanted on the Olympic team because she was the previous Olympic champion. And, you know, this is controversial to say, but I even heard John Orozco, who is a gymnast who was on the men's Olympic team in 2012, and he made 2016, but he got hurt. He's a black man, but he even acknowledged that Gabby Douglas was not really ready, was not in the condition to be on the Olympic team, but for some reason, USA Gymnastics and NBC had decided they liked this idea of having 2 African-American women on the Olympic team. And so she was, you know, so whatever your feelings about that are aside, like if that's being discussed, and it's true, Gabby Douglas was not in the same kind of condition or even close to what she had been in when she won the Olympics in 2012. And Maggie Nichols was really a more even, well-rounded, all-around gymnast. And so the fact that she was not only not chosen for the team, but many people who finished behind her were chosen as alternates, and she wasn't, and just was not mentioned or talked about or anything at all. So I think that, yeah, it's pretty clear. you know, I did not know until this came out that, you know, USA Gymnastics had not authorized like a camera on her family during the championship trials, which always happens with the people who are on the team like the year before. And she had been second at the World Championships the year before. So wouldn't you think that even if she wasn't in as good a shape because she'd been an injury, NBC loves dramatic stories like this person did so amazing and then they had an injury. Will they be able to make it back? They love that shit. They have interviews after interviews after interviews about the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat and all that shit, right? So where was that story, right? And so this was really a conspiracy, or dare I say collusion, between USA Gymnastics and NBC and all, you know, like what, you know, probably start on a certain level, some of the sponsors and things like that to keep this quiet.
I mean, because the president of USA Gymnastics was a marketing guy, so that's going to be his lens of perception. And then there was also the commercial that they pulled her out of mid-filming for no reason. So it seems super obvious.
It is. It's super obvious now. The way, like, right? I think it was good that they didn't directly say it during the film because it left open to this conversation about it, which I think needs to be had. Yeah. But you know, for her, like she was in the uncomfortable in between position of she had still a normal family, normal parents, and a normal coach who are human beings that had not been absorbed by the Borg, right? And she wasn't quite yet the household name or star like Aly Raisman or Simone Biles. Now, since this all came out, Simone Biles and Aly Raisman have both turned into huge thorns in the side of USA Gymnastics, but there was no way they were going to keep the two of them off because that was the gold medal right there, and that was all of the advertising dollars and everything. So she found herself in this funny in-between position, and she really paid the price for it. You know, she paid the price for it, and I recommend people go. You guys can just look on YouTube. You can look at Maggie Nichols' performances at University of Oklahoma. She is a stunning gymnast, like the beautiful technique. Every position she ever hits is gorgeous and worthy of a photograph or a statue or whatever. So I think this was a tragedy that hadn't been paid enough attention to, and I'm glad that that they made that choice, the editorial choice, to tell that story as opposed to ones that everybody already knew.
Yeah, I'm glad too. And she handled herself really well.
She always does. Like,
yeah, she was beautiful with the whole thing.
Yeah, and then so I just have notes that I took when I rewatched about 20 or 30 minutes of it this morning. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because you are a journalist, you're a real journalist, which is why you don't get journalistic work anymore. But what did you think about the way that journalism was portrayed in this documentary? Like, I think that, like, it looks to me like fortunately, this case ended up in the hands of one of the only few true working journalistic newsrooms left in the country. Yeah. And that even though maybe they don't have the depth of weird knowledge that we have to take the story all the way out, they were tenacious and relentless and muckraking like a journalist should be. Yeah?
Yeah, it was really inspiring and also kind of frustrating and sad for me, because I was like, this is real journalism and I miss this experience. Mm-hmm. I didn't know this existed anymore. Every step of the way, even when they interviewed the detective who was on the case and she handled herself so well, there was a piece of me that wondered, am I in a time warp? Am I watching something that actually happened in the 70s? Because I'm not seeing this level of integrity or ethics in journalism, in law enforcement. I was really impressed with the journalists who handled it and that newsroom, and it made me long for, you know, what is no longer a reality in my experience.
Yeah, so I thought that was like a really cool subplot here to this, is that, like, I mean,
they made this happen. They're the ones who blew this up the way good investigative journalists did. It was wonderful.
There's another journalist who wasn't the focus of this, because he came along and started reporting a little bit after, like they did the original story. I can't remember his last name right now. If I can find it, I'll include it in the show notes. He's from Orange County here in Los Angeles. I know his first name is Scott, and he's been relentless at going after some of this as well. Nice. And so it's interesting, like, you know, like there are still journalists out there that will do this. You know what I mean?
Well, that's always what I wonder, because like we know that the newsrooms are compromised. So when you're talking about this guy Scott, even when I'm dealing with these scuzzy newsrooms, like the ones that I've been dealing with and trying to get to some semblance of truth about the fuckery that's going on in New Mexico, I wonder, well, where are those lone rogue journalists who still have ethics, who still have integrity, who are willing to meander around, you know, whatever restrictions are being imposed upon them to actually uncover the truth?
Yeah, well, it's good to know that there are still a few, you know, and it's interesting that there seems to be more journalistic integrity going on in athletics than almost anywhere else right now.
I feel like that's what it was, because I feel like, because these were the sports reporters, and my guess is that whatever restrictions are being imposed by the cabal, by the globalists, by the archons, by like whoever it is, like maybe they're just not messing with the sports reporters, and that's why justice was ultimately able to be served in this scenario.
Well, Robert has talked a lot about, and I think he's talked about it from a different perspective, but like the theme could be the same, that sports is really what's going to be sacrificed during this whole transition that we're in, right? Like that sports will become like, you know, right now, obviously there's been a halt to that, right? Like, you know, there's no sports going on right now. And so, or at least very little, you know, kind of thing. And that there's a lot of things going on in the sporting world that is, he has a term that he uses for the transition from Dionysian, I can't remember what he calls it, but you know, Robert and I talk a lot about sports when we do our kind of stuff, and I think that this, I don't know if this kind of journalism will be allowed to continue in sports, and you know, there's also the perspective that, you know, some of this may have been allowed because the greater control system was wanting a test run to see, because as I'm going to kind of lay out here a little bit, and maybe an ongoing thing, certainly if we're able to get an interview with Jennifer Say, which I hope we are, is that if you really compare it's almost a one-to-one correlation between what's going on in USA Gymnastics and what's going on with the US government in general. So it's like a miniature version, and Larry Nassar, Jeffrey Epstein is Larry Nassar.
Right. Well, Larry Nassar is taking the fall for an infinitely more intricate and nefarious situation. Yeah. That's what concerns me. And you and I have talked about this even with the attention that like Bill Gates and George Soros are getting, that they get these kind of little fish who are portrayed to be the big fish, so that it can go away and be shoved under the rug, and the powers that work can say, oh, we took care of that.
Right. So I think that they would love for us to believe that the problem has been solved because Maggie Haney, who's like a Laurie Hernandez's coach, who recently was suspended from USA Gymnastics for like verbal abuse, you know, emotional abuse. She's been suspended for 8 years. Larry Nassar is in jail. The problem is solved. They would love to have one symbolic, you know, like scapegoat for each. And same with this. We've got the same thing right now with our government, with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, right? Like everybody, look, the pedophilia problem is being, you know, is being taken care of, right? And so I think that maybe like it was probably incredibly organic the way this reporting began, and when the discussion was amongst the powers that shouldn't be, like, should we shut this down or should we see how this plays out so we can know how to play it when it steps out, you know, because it was about almost exactly 4 years later that the Jeffrey Epstein thing really started. About 2 years, the Pizzagate thing, you know, started, but they did a really masterful job at misportraying what Pizzagate really was and making people believe in really dumb things. And then, you know, now this whole thing with Jeffrey Epstein. So I think that, you know, they probably it was, I don't know if it was a direct decision or just at a certain point, okay, we're going to watch how this plays out. We're going to see, you know, the other thing they did is they co-opted a lot of these girls into like the Me Too kind of movement, which is a controlled movement. That doesn't mean that like these things don't happen, but it's controlled, right? So this was a great test case.
Different conversation.
Absolutely. But what I'm saying is to let some of these things play out instead of trying to put the full kibosh on them, gave them a lot of chance to, like, it's like a working case, right? Like, let's see how this goes. Let's see how quickly people forget. Let's see what little things we can get them to latch onto, how much carrot stick games we can play, right? Like all that kind of stuff, so that we have a better idea going into the political rollout, you know, when this stuff starts to come out about really what's going on in the political sphere and the celebrity sphere with this kind of things, we'll have like war gamed it already.
Possibly. I mean, part of me is curious how many, like how deep the levels of control now, how many people really know and how much they're monitoring. Gymnastics is an anomaly of a sport. You know, like it's the hardest sport, but a lot of people don't even really consider it a sport because it's these cute little girls. And, you know, it's not really, I don't think it's given the sort of degree of respect that it deserves. And I think when people think of athletes, it's kind of put in this realm of like dance or performance when it really is like intense athletics. The other piece that I see going on with this, which is, you know, a problem pervading everything, is that they're not integrating. They take out this fragmented piece of the story and they're not weaving it in to the larger narrative. So they say, okay, we put Larry Nassar away, we took care of that. And it's kind of the same thing that I'm witnessing on the Darkhorse podcast when I'm watching Brett and Heather talk about what's going on with BLM and the racial stuff and not understanding how it plays into all the other pieces. So they take these things completely out of context and let these people take the fall, and it kind of off gases the emotion around it and the frustration around it, but it's not dealing with the larger
it's a pressure release. And actually this is why I thought that what I really liked about the way Jennifer Stay presented this is she was clear to bring up the emotional abuse of just the everyday coaches and of the accepted part of the system, you know, in general. All right, so the next thing I had said, so, you know, one of the things before we kind of move on to, well, here we go. So we know, like it was talked about in the documentary through the figure of Rachel Den Hollander, who was just an average person, not a famous gymnast, right? That we all knew that USA Gymnastics had been burying sexual abuse for decades, right? But there was, you know, this thing that you and I talked about that we knew it when we were kids, but no one ever finally said anything, but she did in a very bold way. This not famous gymnast came forward and said, hey, you know, there had been complaint, you know, she was the first person to publicly out in front of everybody with the press. So Maggie Nichols was the first one to complain to USA Gymnastics, but Rachel Den Hollander was the first person to really go public with her own name, say what was going on. And so I thought, you know, that was kind of an interesting part of it.
One piece though that I want to jump in on is the fact that this had been happening for so long, and they went as far back as Tracy Talavera, who trained with us at Gymnastics Olympica. I don't know if you remember her.
I remember.
But this guy who was head of USA Gymnastics just was in there for the last few years. So why were they not tracing these decades and decades of burying and collusion and what that is about? And why wasn't that acknowledged in the documentary?
So I think one of the things I think I think you only have so much time in the documentary, but if you listen to Jennifer, she did talk about Don Peters, who was here in Southern California. So I think what happened is I think like in the 70s and 80s, the hotbed of sexual abuse in gymnastics was here on the West Coast in Southern California with Don Peters, with Doug Bogart, who is, if you saw him, you'd be like, oh yeah, I remember this fool. You know, and there is a connection because he's only brought up tangentially in the film, but Ron Gallimore was also around at Gymnastics Olympica when we were kids, and he was second to Steve Penny at USA Gymnastics. So there is this long, you know, and Robert and I did a show on Ron Gallimore and his astrology, and he's kind of an interesting character in all of this and whatnot. And then in the 90s and the 2000s, the hotbed. So I would say in the 70s and 80s, it was in Southern California, and then like maybe going on like in Connecticut on the East Coast. Like I've heard some stories from people about that. And then in the 90s and 2000s, like mostly focused in Houston, like early 2000s in Houston, around the Corolla.
That was the piece that I wanted them to go after the Karolyi's harder and to focus on where this Soviet influence came in and how that had, like they touched on it, but the Karolyi's got basically a pass.
Yeah, well, they've largely gotten a pass because there's not any evidence that they ever actually did any of the stuff, but they were really the people who, and I think Jennifer said it really beautifully in there, like cruelty was already part of gymnastics in the United States, but US had not been successful. When they came and made USA successful, it validated that technique and it solidified it and turned it into something that people were willing to accept. That's the thing with the American sort of mind is this idea of success at any cost, right? Like
totally. It was so interesting to see all the gold medalists looking miserable.
Miserable.
Like, no, you know, aside from Mary Lou, who was always an anomaly, always miserable. And it reminded me of like, wow, every time I want to meet, I was miserable too. Like, I didn't know what to do with that, because you're just always like, but it wasn't good enough, but I messed up that thing, but when am I going to get it?
Or it was more of just a relief. It wasn't as much of a celebration, or it was more of like a relief. Okay, I'm not going to get screamed at or whatever, because yeah, I did well enough that, yeah, so now I can just go eat whatever I want for one meal, and then it'll be back to the same bullshit.
Right.
One of the things, though, and I think Rachel Den Hollander sort of displayed this, but it's something that I noticed when I was watching the girls testify and give their statements in court after he'd been sentenced and whatnot, and was certainly the case for me, is that we did not understand certain issues were like, that were the result of sexual abuse, right? Like, so I got to a place in my life where I was having all sorts of struggles in life that were this matched up with people who had had sexual abuse, but I had not come to the clarity yet that some of the things that I had experienced were sexual abuse, right? And so it's like all of a sudden, so it was such an ingrained part of the culture that like we didn't even like where does that happen, that a person is like, I mean, I guess in domestic abuse cases it happens too, but something becomes so normalized or so like just buried underneath things that a person doesn't even recognize until the other people start talking about it. Right? That, oh, well, that happened to me too. Oh, well, no wonder I haven't been able to have a relationship and I'm 35 years old. No wonder, like, anytime somebody tries to touch me, I jump out of my skin. No, for all these years, you're just thinking something's wrong with you.
But look at how old we were when we started gymnastics. Like, they got our grips on us from so little.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we were brought up, and that was so normalized from, like, I was 3 when I started gymnastics. I think you were as well.
I started 2, yeah.
Okay,
and I started at Gymnastics Olympica. I was there the whole time, yeah.
And my parents always deferred to the coaches. Always. Whatever they said was right. It didn't matter. So we didn't have a fighting chance.
Yeah. Yeah. But it was very, like, it was very under the radar, right? Like, we all kind of knew but that something was weird, but maybe we just thought that was a normal thing for gymnastics. And so we just.
Our lives were so weird. It was such a weird childhood. You couldn't compare it to, you know, we were always the weirdos at school or with anyone else.
Yeah.
You know, like, we didn't have anything, and we were young, innocent kids. We just didn't know.
Yeah, so the other person that was focused on in this documentary that probably isn't a household name to people that I thought was interesting is Jamie Dancer. And Jamie Dancer is another person that I would consider a victim of the entire system, for some of the same reasons that now Jamie did make the Olympic team, so she didn't have her dream stolen in quite the same way. But Jamie's an interesting case, and I actually have some personal interaction with Jamie Dancer. I used to coach for a short period of time at the gym she trained at, Charter Oak Gliders. And she grew up around here, so I saw her in competitions because I was already coaching from the time she was incredibly little. She and Vanessa Atler came up together. Vanessa Atler was the much more famous of the two, who ultimately ended up, you know, kind of crashing and burning and not making the Olympic team. And Jamie Dancer sort of overcame and made it. But I worked in the gym in Charter Oak while she was in, you know, probably some of the best years of her career. And again, I would say this is a person who didn't fit 100% the usual mold. She was a little bit more oppositional than a lot of the other gymnasts, which to me makes her an interesting person. She was very nice. She used to talk to me sometimes, but she was constantly in trouble. She was constantly being sent, you know, out of training and whatnot. But it isn't just, so she ended up in the sexual abuse situation, but she did it didn't really get straight to it, but she talked about how much she always hated her coaches, right? And how difficult it was for, you know, and she was coached by Steve and Beth Rybacki. And they're kind of a weird, I don't care for Steve Rybacki, and I'm going to tell you guys why right here. But this goes for the kind of institutional, like, corruption and lack of integrity. So the reason that I think I've always felt like Steve Rybacki was weird, and it always felt like something weird was going on there. Like, Beth Rybacki was on the 1980 Olympic team that didn't get to go because the boycott. Her name was Beth Klein at the time. And I think she's significantly younger than him. She married him very young, and they're a, you know, husband and wife coaching team, and they've had a number of girls on the national team. They've been very successful. And Steve is part of the national team coaching staff. You saw him many times in that documentary. He was only referred to once or twice. He was copied in on some of those emails that shows he knew this was going on and never said anything. And he was also Jamie Dancer's coach. But I didn't really like working there. I didn't fit in at all, right? I didn't enjoy being there. And so I got fired, and I was totally okay with getting fired because I didn't like working there, but I had a huge problem with the way that I got fired. And the way that I got fired was that I was pulled into the office by the secretary after practice on Friday and told that my services were not needed, and I was given my paycheck, and that was it. So, okay, what are you gonna do? Nobody else Steve wasn't at the gym at that time, and he obviously didn't want to deal with it because he had the secretary do it, right? So, okay, we had a meet that weekend, but they fired me on Friday, so obviously I'm not going to the meet. And I just felt like that was shitty, the way he did that, right? And then about 3 months, maybe somewhere between 3 and 6 months later, the parents of one of the girls had somehow gotten my phone number and called me and wanted to know why I did that to the girls. She couldn't understand it. And I'm like, what are you talking about? She was like, you didn't show up for their meet. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, we had a meet and you didn't show up. That's what, there was like another guy that I worked with, I forget his name, was like Jamie. Like we were both coaching like maybe that wasn't his name, I can't remember. Not Jamie Dant, it was a man. Like we were coaching like the levels 5 to 7. And she said, yeah, you didn't show up. And we wondered where you were and they told us you didn't show up. And I was like, they fired me on Friday. So they fired me on Friday and then told the girls that I didn't show up for their competition. So forget about how shitty that makes me look. How does that feel for girls who their coach, just doesn't show up before the meet, so they have no coach for the things that they've been, it would have made much more sense to fire me on Monday if you really cared about the girls.
Of course, but they don't care about the girls. And what I think, like, we cannot underscore, is that the right, I don't know if that's the right word, yeah. But psychological abuse is deliberately utilized to get certain performances out of the gym. They do not care how much it is traumatizing us. They are fucking with our psychology and our emotions the whole time to create champions. Or to create division, or whatever it is. But like, we were not considered human, so I'm not surprised that they would lie to the girls, and it would be so traumatic to show up for a meet and have your coach not be there, who knows your timing and knows where you need the board to be and cares about you.
So then not only am I not there, but they're wondering why. It's not like I'm not there and they're saying, oh, she's sick. That makes sense. It sucks, but you can move on. They're acting like it's a fucking big mystery. Where's Emily, right? So this kind of lack of integrity, right? Like, and then you have all of these, because this was back in like the mid 90s, right? You have all these years later, him being copied in on these emails that are evidence that they knew this abuse was going on and nothing was being done, right? So like, this is why, like, a lot of people might say something like, oh, Emily's just bitter because she got fired. I don't care. I didn't like working there, you know what I mean? And whatnot. But the bigger point of is like, look at what that, like, the person who's going to do, like, why didn't he just like tell the truth? Like, that's a stupid small thing, right? But that kind of lack of integrity is apparently rampant and apparently not a problem for USA Gymnastics. And in fact, I would think that kind of behavior actually, that they know that this person is also going to cover up for them, going to be willing to overlook poor behavior like that from other people, even if he's not the sexual abuser, which I don't know what his, I don't know what he's into or what his kind of shit is or whatever. But when I've always known that he's a creep. Right, and when that stuff came out that he was copied in on those emails, I'm like, of course he was, right? Of course he was. And I'm just gonna say, he's like, you guys can go back and find video of him verbally abusing Vanessa Atler after she fell off the bars at the USA Championships. So it's been out there in the public for a long time that this guy is not a good guy. He's exerted extreme.
Didn't all of our coaches verbally abuse you like that?
But usually they had the good sense to wait until the camera wasn't there. Okay. So he had such a power over his athletes and over the sort of what was going on that he could do that and not only get away with it, but continue to have this high level job, right? Even though it's out there in front on TV, NBC for everybody to see, right? He had such a level of control over his athletes. I would go as far as to say he has that level of control over his wife too. Because I ran into his wife in 2003. I was at the World Championships watching, and I was in a restaurant in the hotel or something before we went to the meet, and I ran into her in the bathroom. And she was like, she recognized me, but you could tell she wasn't quite sure from where. She's like, oh my God, I haven't seen you in so long. Like, how do I know you? You look amazing, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, I used to, oop, you there? You there? You there?
Yeah.
Okay. What was the last thing you heard?
You went to a restaurant during the World Championships.
Yeah, so I was in the restaurant that was like closest to the arena, and I went to the bathroom, and I ran into Beth Rybacki in the bathroom. And she could tell, she obviously recognized me, couldn't quite place from where, because it had been like 8 or 10 years since I, seen her or whatever. And she was like, oh my God, you look amazing. How do I know you? And I was like, well, I've known you for years because I competed around here, but also I used to work at your gym. I was like, and just so you know, like your husband fired me in a really unethical way. And she was just like, I don't know anything about that kind of stuff, but it was so nice to see you. You look amazing. Like a fucking programmed bot. You know what I mean?
Here's what my theory about gymnastics, especially where it's gone and the level of tricks that these girls are doing. I don't think gymnastics would exist the way it is without psychological, emotional, and physical abuse. I really don't think it's possible to get these girls to do what they're doing. I don't think it was possible to get us to do what we were doing without that type of abuse.
So I would say I'm mostly on board with what you're saying. I think there's a few outliers, right? And if you like right now, like one of the stories I'm tracking in the background is this adult gymnastics journey of Chelsea Memel, right? And Chelsea Memel is a girl who like blew onto the scene at that same World Championships in 2003, right? And then missed the Olympics in 04, 08, and 12 because of injuries and retired. And now at 32, she was just playing around, like doing adult gymnastics, but she's incredibly talented and has regained most of her skills. And at 32, because of this extra year now, looks like she's going to be making a go for it. And she, for the most part, appears to me, she was trained by her parents, mostly. She appears to be, and there was some controversy about some of the teams she was left off of too and whatnot. But, she appears to me to be a mostly healthy person who just happens to be incredibly naturally gifted with spatial awareness and all that kind of stuff. So I'd say that there are a few outliers, but the ability for United States, and then previous to that, the Soviet Union and Romania, who have fallen as their countries have gone into different kinds of turmoil, to year after year after year continually produce athletes at this level, that yes, that is just baked into the cake, and that there's only a few people that naturally would attain that level of unusual ability based just on their talent and regular hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So there was that. And then, so Jamie had been subject to all sorts of like just disintegrity in terms of behavior of the coaches around here, psychological abuse, sexual abuse. And then, let's see what else. Some people knew about the Carolis. We already talked about that. And then, yeah, I think that's enough. I think that's kind of where, like, the only thing I would say is that I thought, Jennifer Say's interviews, like they interviewed Jennifer Say, like for one kind of big segment in the middle of the documentary and a few other little bits. I think she's interesting. She's intellectual. I'm interested in reading her book Chalked Up, which I read clips from, but I've never read the whole thing. And I think she has a new version she just put out. But I do feel like she has a very holistic, well-rounded view of what's going on. And I think that, I would like to, I'm going to read that book and then see if maybe I can reach out to her and just be like, look, this is going to seem different than most of the interviews. And here's the thing, if I'm open, like I want to kind of lay out sort of like what I think, what we think, the larger thing is here and how this plays into.
What do you think the larger thing is?
Well, I think that that's the reason. So there's still this ongoing frustration of the gymnastics community that like not more has been done, right? That there hasn't been more laws passed, that there hasn't been. But even Jennifer Say, there's one line in the thing where she talks about going to Dianne Feinstein and her helping them and whatever. Like, I don't know if Jennifer Say is aware of the incredible corruption of Dianne Feinstein. And that doesn't mean, sure, on a certain level, like even if people who aren't our favorites are willing to do things that help us with our cause, okay, in this case, maybe it was worth doing that. But you can't really expect the same hen the wolf that's guarding the hen house to like actually care about this. This is a lot of like, in my opinion, virtue signaling behavior or making like a public show of something being done, but it hasn't been backed up by anything. It took the FBI years to arrest Steve Penny, right? Even after Steve Penny alerted the FBI, they didn't start investigating for a really long time. And I would basically say that the exact same corruption that you are witnessing and questioning in USA Gymnastics is going on in our own government. And it's going on both sides. It's not, there's not one side better than the other. They're all involved in, blackmail, like making political decisions based on financial contributions, based on blackmail, based on brownstoning operations, which is how you catch people in compromised sexual positions and then get them to do your political bidding for you. And all the same, I would suggest that all the same things that are going on in USA Gymnastics are going on in our government, but to a much higher degree. And so the idea that they're going to help you, or that there's somehow that there's going to be laws passed that really help this, and I would say that safe sport is like the same thing as like Amber Alert, right? Like Amber Alert, was mostly run by the same lady who was caught child trafficking kids from Haiti, right? And so that's the same kind of thing. And so we need to have a larger conversation as a gymnastics community and as a society in general. And the point is not to pass laws or catch this person or arrest that person. The point is we all have to become aware of how pedophilia, political manipulation, blackmail, all this kind of stuff works, and how our society has gotten to this place because of doing things that are disintegrous, right? And not admitting when we've made a mistake. And then you are suddenly in a position where someone has information on you and they can get you to do something that maybe isn't what you want to do, but you're willing to do it to preserve your career, or so that this thing that you cheated on your wife didn't come out. And next thing you know, you're covering for a pedophile, right? And it's, this is the deep-seated abscess that's at the basis of everything we're experiencing right now. That's why there are, it seems like it's not connected, but it's directly connected to why our population is walking around with masks over their face right now, because nobody can, it's symbolic. People cannot fit this. My friend Jeff Gates said, it's about not being able to face the lie that you've been living. We've all been living a lie, right? And it's that everything is okay. Everything is not okay, but it's not because of a virus and not because of, this horrible systemic racism. We're not saying that racism doesn't exist on some levels, but it's that same government and corporations that are perpetuating this pedophilia shit, that are perpetuating racist policies, not most of the people of America, right? And our refusal to look at our unwillingness to be aware of what's going on and stop just pretending that evil doesn't exist in the way that, right? That's why we're in this situation on every level. And I think, unfortunately, gymnastics is a very sheltered, these kids are very sheltered in a lot of ways, and the community is as a whole, and they don't know that much about what's going on in the world at large. I think Jennifer Say may have I think she's smart enough and been exposed to enough other things that maybe, I don't know if she's ever looked into mind control or what MK Ultra is, or brownstoning projects, or, mind control drugs, this kind of stuff. And, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't all these years later. It wasn't until I watched this documentary last week that I thought, oh, maybe that level of abuse was not okay. I didn't even think to question it. And then there's the other piece of all the mind control. And when we would go down to the dungeon to listen to our concentration and visualization recordings, and that whole piece of it.
The whole hypnotic suggestion and NLP and, implanted memory, all this kind of stuff, right? I'm going to actually get into, right after this, I'm doing a show with Masaki, and we're going to talk about the mind control and sexual abuse that's going on in the dance music community too. And that, someone who's incredibly famous, literally lifting techniques and logos and symbols from a book on mental domination for his act. You know what I mean? And so it's right out there for everybody to see, but most people think that humanity, people are not willing to look at how gross people can be. And so it keeps it makes a great sort of hiding place for the gross people, because nobody wants to believe that it's true. But it's true.
100%. Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway, all right. So I think we're done. Are we complete on the athlete day? You guys go watch it though. It's really good. And then go check out some of Maggie Nichols' beautiful gymnastics. And there's some other cool stuff in the documentary. I think it was really well done. Kudos to Jennifer Say for, I think, telling the story in a better, much better way than if we would have gotten this sort of thing from ESPN or NBC or whatever. So Yeah.
Totally.
Great.
Yeah, she did a great job. Definitely
Great.
worth a watch.
And kudos to the journalists, you know what I mean, for following this one through.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next thing, like we want to go to Bari Weiss, the Weinstein brother, those things are connected. Bari Weiss and the Weinsteins are connected.
Where do you want to start? How do you want to get us into that?
Let's go to Bari Weiss first.
Okay.
So why don't you tell people about Bari Weiss? Who's Bari Weiss?
Okay, so what I know of Bari Weiss is she was a writer for the New York Times, and she also wrote a book. She's super pro-Israel, right? I think that's what her book was about.
I know she had a book.
Yes, she had a book, and she was her last Joe Rogan show. She talked about her book, and it's all about how Israel's amazing, from what I understood. And she was also known for writing about the intellectual dark web and putting sort of them on the map in the mainstream through the New York Times. And she just resigned in this very public way with this public letter lambasting the New York Times for being a bastion of like leftist thought police who was intolerant of any other perspectives, and she couldn't take it anymore, and so she's out.
So,
I mean, there might be holes in my my assessment.
She's an opinion writer for the New York Times. She right, and she's worked there for a couple of years. And
3 years.
She came on to my radar the first time she was on Joe Rogan when she called Tulsi Gabbard an Assad toady. And there's lots of problems with Tulsi Gabbard. We've talked about them here, mostly that she's a
She ain't no Assad toady.
And she disappeared, and that she's just disappeared since she turned her coat. You know what I mean? But she's not an Assad toady, and that's not really even a thing. And she is Bari Weiss, I would say, is like, I don't know, I'd call her a centrist, like neoliberal, right? Who like is maybe a little bit more conservative on some issues than most of the people at the New York Times. She's also,
I think she just hasn't drunk the leftist Kool-Aid per se, but she's certainly not like right.
No, she's that annoying centrist neocon neoliberal, right? But I'd say there's two things. She's not super like the far left Kool-Aid, and she's also just kind of like a whiny, annoying girl who I could see, like that's the kind of girl sometimes that gets bullied, you know, and they probably didn't like her for a million other reasons, but yes, like she wasn't part of the mainstream culture at the New York Times. And
she kind of reminded me of us a little bit in just being like a loudmouth, smart Jewish girl who shares her opinions, and that would make her unpopular.
So there might be some of that, but I think she's like, I don't know. She has a much looser relationship with the truth, I think.
Yes,
I do. And her big complaint, like the big thing that's been going on the last week is all these writers coming out and saying we have to stop, cancel culture, or all these like public figures. And so this was sort of part of that, right? Kind of thing. Like she came out at the same period of time complaining about like this hive mind at the New York Times. And if you don't go along with it, then they bully you or they cancel you. But she literally built her career on being a proponent of cancel culture from the time she was a student at Columbia, where she intentionally tried to get, she maybe even succeeded at getting a professor who was actually Palestinian. So for him to be pro-Palestine is just an act of survival, not even necessarily a political act, right? That she called him an anti-Semite and was involved in a campaign to get him canceled, right? And she obviously was, did that on the Joe Rogan podcast with Tulsi Gabbard. She lambasted Joe Rogan for liking her and whatnot. And she has continuously—
Based on nothing, like based on actually no knowledge or information.
She didn't even know what the word toady meant. You guys go watch the clip. She called Tulsi Gabbard an Assad toady and then had to admit she didn't even know how to spell toady or what the word meant. Right? So there was that. And Joe Rogan like totally embarrassed her. That was one of his finer moments. It was pretty good. Yeah. But and then she's constantly accusing people who she disagrees with of being anti-Semites. Instead of taking them to task based on what they've said and telling them why they're wrong in their opinion about whatever, she just calls anybody who doesn't agree with her in terms of the sort of Israel conversation or the whatever.
Pro-Israel.
Yeah, she's super pro-Israel. And instead of just saying, you know what, I'm pro-Israel, so you know what I mean? Like, but she uses the anti-Semite thing the same way people use the Nazi thing and the racist thing. She does the exact same thing that she's now complaining was done to her. Yeah.
Yes, 100%.
So, okay, so that, like, it's just, like, at the height of hypocrisy, and yeah.
have a different perspective on this.
Okay.
Because I agree that it was hypocritical of her. And anytime I've heard her speak about Israel and Jewishness and whatever, I'm annoyed and I'm cringy and I don't want to pay attention. And I feel like the piece that you sent me where they were going off on her for being a hypocrite, I feel like people are being really, really mean to her about it. And I agree that it's completely hypocritical. And I also think, personally, I think it was a strong move to walk away from the New York Times, and I'm happy she did it. And I do think it was hypocritical, but to like nail her to the cross for being a hypocrite and all of that just feels a little extreme. I think it's more positive than negative that she walked away and called the New York Times out. And I do see the hypocrisy. I just feel like people are going for her jugular in a way that feels really extreme.
I think there's separate issues, and maybe we would be better to look at them separately. It's wonderful that she's had this recognition about the New York Times, because everything she said is 100% true. And what would have made this, I think, more effective and would have, I think, landed better with some people is if she had said, you know what, I have participated in this cancel culture, and it wasn't until I was on the receiving end of it did I understand why it's wrong. And had that been included, but there's a reason why it wasn't, in my opinion, and I'm going to get there.
Okay, so I want to get there. I'm really excited because I feel it was interesting in watching whatever the show was that you sent me, Crystal Ball, I think, and someone else. And they were saying the exact same thing. Well, if she had just apologized, and I really don't like this prescription coming out of the fake woke left that tells people that they need to apologize and they need to say that they're in a learning experience. And here's the script that you have to say to get out of cancel culture jail. So I hear what you're saying, and there's an aspect of me that totally understands, but I'm so tired of this culture going after people like rabid feral dogs. And she is young. She's in her 30s, right? I agree with what you're saying to an extent, but I also feel like I don't want to give people scripts and tell them that if you don't do it in this woke right way, then you're wrong. And personally, I hate everything she says about Israel and anti-Semitism. I really hate all of it. And I think that this is more important, and this was a strong move. And it's interesting to me that I'm not seeing anyone who's able to talk about it just as what it means to journalism. And it's just, she just keeps getting caught up in the hate mill. And I'm not even saying that you're wrong. I'm just tired of if we don't do it this way.
I think that they should be addressed separately. What she says about the New York Times is true, and it's good she said it, right? We shouldn't have a script that you have to follow in order to not be canceled, right? So we shouldn't say she should have said this, right? But it would have, I'm not saying she should have, but I think it would have landed better with people, and it would have lent a strength to her argument if she had just acknowledged, right, in her own way. Even if
but here's the thing. Here's the problem with that, is that assumes that she feels bad for canceling people who are anti-Israel. We don't know that that's the case. The whole Israel-Palestine conversation is its own anomaly that's taken, which is why it exists, that we have, these prohibitions against criticizing Israel. So to say that she should have apologized for this position, we don't know that she's sorry for it. We don't know that she's going to double back on calling anyone who's pro-Palestine and anti-Semitic.
Absolutely. So like I'm saying, the separate issues are, it's right, she's right about the New York Times. She has participated in cancel culture. And I'm not saying she should have done anything else, but all I'm saying is there can be a discussion or a recognition of the fact, right, that this may have landed better with certain people, right, if she had at least acknowledged the fact that maybe that she has participated in it. Maybe even say, you know what, I think that's, that's a separate thing. I think this is a more important issue, right? And if you want to cancel people, I'm not saying it's right.
Why does she have to be concerned with how it lands?
Because she's complaining about cancel culture.
So what? She can be a hypocrite if she wants to. It doesn't delegitimize the fact that what the New York Times is doing is wrong. And to expect everyone to be these paragons of integrity and it is ridiculous. She can be a hypocrite And she could also be totally right.
Totally right.
And calling the New York Times out. And I don't like that we expect, because it's fake. If we expect her to say this perfect script to excuse herself, we don't know that she actually believes that. We know that that's what she's supposed to say to get out of cancel culture jail. And
I 100%,
everything.
I 100% agree with you that she shouldn't say it if she doesn't believe it. 100%. 100%. But the reason she has received so much flack is because it's very ironic and right that a person who has participated in so much canceling would complain about canceling.
Except, I mean, don't get me wrong. The hypocrisy is super clear, and I don't like Bari Weiss for this aspect of her. I don't like for this reason. But she didn't. I don't like any aspects. She didn't just leave the New York Times because of cancel culture.
No.
She left because of the whole culture and the way that news is being distorted and manipulated through this lens. And the fact that everyone is choosing to pick on cancel culture is allowing us to miss the larger issue, which is that our large mainstream news sources are lying to us. And that's what annoys me about this whole conversation.
I get it.
All the focus has gone into what a hypocrite Bari Weiss is, and we're not talking about what really matters.
I get it. I get what you're saying. It's kind of like when the whole thing happened with the WikiLeaks and Hillary Clinton's emails. People just focused on that it was WikiLeaks who put them out, and not on the fact that nobody ever denied that those were their emails. I get what you're saying. It's just that she's so unappealing because of these things that it's hard for people to hear the important part that you're talking about, because it is important what she said. And then on to how this connects to the other chicanery. So I actually think that she did this to preserve her career, because I do think that the New York Times is ultimately going to go down, and it's going to go down pretty quick when it happens on a certain level. I think they're going to get shit wrong again, right? They're going to get shit wrong again.
Shit wrong every day.
Right. But I mean, in terms of like the election and all that, right? They're going to get shit wrong. I think this is a move she's doing. I think that there's probably about to be a huge media project launched by the Weinstein wing of the intellectual dark web, because you've noticed they've really been upping their sort of presence. And the first person to come to Bari's defense when all this went down was Eric Weinstein. And he was, did you see the tweets he made?
No, I didn't.
Oh my God.
I mean, he's super, Brett and Eric cling to their Judaism and their Jewish pride
so the whole
like
thing.
No one else.
So she's going to be, I think they're going to start their own media operation, or just, kind of thing. And that she's probably going to be one of the prime journalists, kind of like how after how the Intercept launched out of the Glenn Greenwald thing with the Edward Snowden, right? This is going to come out of kind of this. She's going to be working with them. And Eric has these tweets about, just a few weeks ago, I had Bari Weiss on my podcast. And a couple of times during the podcast, she said, I can't talk about that. And so he was talking about how she was so stifled by her job at the New York Times, and bravo for her for leaving that controlling, manipulative place where she was paid tons of money to perpetuate the bullshit, all that kind of crap, right? And now it's like Bari's going to come back, and now she's going to tell the full truth about everything that she couldn't, blah, blah, blah. And he just is, just basically saying what a hero and a brave girl she is, right?
Okay, here's why this is interesting to me, is that over the weekend I was listening to Bret Easton Ellis's interview on Dave Rubin, and he was really taking the New York Times to task. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Like, he's such an established figure. It's great that he's taking them down. And then I remembered his interview with Eric Weinstein, and I went back to go look at it. So I'm taking a leap, but I'm just noticing that through line. When I heard him criticize the New York Times, it sent me back to Weinstein. And it is, and also I can no longer listen to the Darkhorse podcast. And I'm really bummed to say that, because I did reach out to Heather, and I do think the way they're talking about race relations is so important. And when I tried to listen to number 30, the propaganda about the virus was so thick, I just thought, what are you guys really up to? It was very hard to me. And I know that I am more conspiratorial minded, so it's easy for me to go to paranoia and they're in collusion, and maybe that isn't the case, but I could not for the life of me understand how they could be saying the things they were saying from an honest, authentic place.
Because this is whenever like an old paradigm kind of winds to an end, right? The new, so like something has been exposed, but the new fact, the new truth is always like the new layer of bullshit is always founded on a truth that was discovered from the other. So they're allowed to tell the truth about something to build consensus and trust in them while they lay the new foundation of bullshit. So they're going to be allowed to talk about some of this stuff, but they're only going to talk about some of this race stuff from a certain perspective. Robert and I are going to mash on this week. He has a lot of theories about the Weinsteins and Evergreen and what went on there, and I do too, and I think I'm going to connect the Weinstein, the stuff at Evergreen to possibly being a place where 5G was rolled out earlier, and that sort of created some of that ability to create that frantic behavior that we saw there, and that these things are actually being perpetrated and controlled and staged, not just through like intentional actors, but literally using the technology to whip people in certain areas up into a frenzy, right? So think about this. Evergreen is to these George Floyd riots what USA Gymnastics and Larry Nassar is to fucking Pizzagate and the larger pedophilia issue. We have a miniature version.
You see that,
and then the maximum version, right? And the one, and Eric and Brett is right in the middle of that, but like Eric has to be the more controlling, dominating force, right?
Yeah, he's the dom in their dom sub.
And there's all sorts of coded information. Robert hasn't laid out his full theory to me. I haven't we're going to get into it. I just wanted to kind of tease it out here. But I'm going to say this, like they are like, so when the Intercept came out of that whole like thing after Snowden, right? That's when the Intercept was born, right? And the Intercept tells a tremendous amount of truth about a small portion of things, and then repeats the fucking deep state bullshit and the globalism bullshit, the socialist bullshit for everything else. That's going to be what this is. You have not heard, so this is going to be like, I think, sort of like a media project, like a mixed media kind of cultural project that is based around the ideas of the intellectual dark web, to this day, of which a lot of these people who've been in, you know, like controversial situations that brought a lot of attention to them, like Jordan Peterson, like Brett Weinstein, and now like Steven Pinker and all this kind of stuff. These are all people, no person who has had any connection or relation to the internet intellectual dark web has ever challenged Israel. There's not a member of it that is pro-Palestine, or even just like even on the topic, they don't talk about it, right? So it wouldn't surprise me if this project is going to be funded by Israel, by Israeli intelligence, or whatever it is, right? Like this is not, and Jordan Peterson is back in the loop all of a sudden, and all these intellectual dark web figures are back in the loop in the last 4 to 6 weeks.
Okay, that's really interesting. So here are the pieces, and maybe you can help me put them together if they don't. And I'm so excited for this upcoming Matrix mash.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone from the intellectual dark web is writing the narrative that the virus is real and we must social distance and mask. Even Brett wears his bandana during his podcast, proudly in every single podcast. And the other piece that I've noticed is that, like, I just watched the Matt Taibbi interview with Brett. Is it everything is, they talk about these things as though they're not connected, and it feels like a dithering while Rome burns. Like, yeah.
So I also,
you're way smarter than this. Like, why are we not connecting the dots? And it feels like a giant distraction tactic.
This is where I was done with, you know, because just last week when there had been a podcast that Brett and Heather did, and we were like, you know, we have tremendous disagreements with them, but they're right on some things, and you know Heather, so let's reach out and see if they really are open to having conversations, and if unity is more important than division and all of this stuff that they say. Of course, there was no response, and then we see this in this kind of stuff. I was done with Brett when I heard it. I didn't finish his interview with Matt Taibbi because I felt I had just heard 2 long interviews with Matt Taibbi with other people that I thought were incredibly good. And this was like, I stopped listening after a certain point because they hadn't talked about cancel culture, but not about the Bari Weiss piece and whatever, right? They hadn't talked anything about that. And I figured they were sort of avoiding that part because they didn't want to talk about the Jewish question or whatever, right? So that
JQ, as Sally called it.
So I turned it off. So I don't know. I never got to hear them talk about the other stuff, but that is my one. I love Matt Taibbi. He's one of my favorite journalists. I think he is a good guy, but sometimes when he's talking to someone face to face, he doesn't go after it as aggressively as he does in his writing.
Well, and as well as when you're on someone's show, like for me, I'm just kind of following their lead. But the other piece that I wanted to bring in as far as this Israeli control is that you have Eric Weinstein is he talks so much about Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine. And I feel like it's like, oh, look, I'm into this cool conspiracy, so don't pay attention to this.
They're getting out in front of it and controlling it from the front.
Exactly. And he's constantly talking about their connections to Mossad. And then there's did you watch that video with the Israeli government talking about how they were planning to use BLM as a way to come in and control? Did you see that?
I haven't seen that yet. I saw that there was. You sent it to me, but I haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
Okay, let's bookmark that because I really want to know your thoughts on that and how that is folding in to what's going on, given that they're pretty much leading the forefront of the sort of intellectual BLM questioning, but it feels like there is an Israeli connection there.
Yeah, well, and also, like, if they're invading through the BLM, it's also interesting because the aggressive police force tactics that are used in this country are learned from Israel. Like, the head of police departments go to Israel to be trained on the tactics that they use in the IDF. So, what's going on here?
Yeah, what's going on here?
Right? So, yeah. Okay. So there's something, like, if there's something going on with the intellectual dark web and with the Weinstein brothers in particular, for sure. But I just at this point, the intellectual dark web is exactly that. It's a web that it's a dark web that you get caught in because they sound a little smarter and a little more intellectual and are like literally, I'll say it's exactly what I called it as a couple of years ago. They widened the margins on the conversation about a centimeter on each side, and everybody was so tired of being stifled that felt like a massive pressure release, like you were just talking about. And really,
we were so excited for like a second.
Right, and it never actually went anywhere that has any meaning at all for freedom or honesty or any of that kind of stuff.
I want to feel into that. I'm not, you might be right. I just want to feel into that before I sign off. Is Majid part of the intellectual dark web? Because he is critical of what's happening in the whole Muslim culture, but I don't know if he's considered an IDW dude.
So he's, I think, maybe like tangentially part of that, because a lot of people are part of the, like, there are people like Joe Rogan and Majid Nawaz and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and stuff like that.
Like IDW adjacent.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So, but so I know he's critical of the Arab shit, but he's still not critical of Israel.
Yeah, you're right.
Right? Like, they'll sacrifice a few Arabs. Yeah, no, this is the whole thing is, like, even the Arabs that Dave Rubin has on his show are all pro-Israel.
Has he not had any?
He has never had anybody on there who challenges anything about Israel. Never, ever, ever, ever. If he has, right, or if he has, then somehow it happened in a pocket universe that I'm not a part of, right? So, like,
I'm not aware of it either.
And you can interview someone without agreeing with them, right? But the fact that there's such a concerted effort on all of these people's media to never include anybody who is just even critical of Israeli foreign policy or is pro-Palestinian, or if they do have anyone on who's ever talked about that stuff, they don't talk about it with them when they're on, right? They focus on something else, just like Brett focused with Matt Taibbi on something different than what he'd been talking about, even though that was really the story. So, it's like he would look like he was avoiding something if he didn't have Matt Taibbi on, but by having Matt Taibbi talk about nonsense, it makes it look like the nonsense is important instead of a story.
I love how only a week ago we were both so pro Darkhorse, and 1 week later we're like, can't even listen anymore.
It wasn't pro Darkhorse. This is what it was. Like, people have been saying, okay, like, it would be interesting to have you talk to some of these political people. Obviously, like, at least in my case, like, I totally disagree with them because I don't believe there's any saving the political system, or even if there was, that it's worth doing, right? So I'm in disagreement with almost everybody we might interview, right? Because they still believe in government. But you and I had both, after like several months of being sort of given up on them, listened to like actually a podcast where I could get on board from like I thought the things they were talking about were reasonable in a world where government still exists. Doesn't mean that I'm pro that. So, and they were talking about how like it's really much more, it's so important for unity right now, unity versus division. And I thought that what they talked about in relation to that idea was coherent. And I was like, okay, I can have a conversation with these people about this stuff and it could be interesting. We'll probably agree on some things and disagree, and it would be an interesting conversation. And then it was almost like they got your email and they were like, oh fuck, we're giving people like, you know, but you have to like go like, or whatever. It literally was like that. Like you said,
they think we're in the same conversation.
Yes, like we're giving people the wrong idea here. We have to get back on the train to Auschwitz, right?
Totally.
Right? So, you know, that's kind of, you know, that's what it is. So I don't think it was that we were pro that. It was just that there seemed an opening for a conversation that could be controversial and fascinating, and that we would have treated them with respect. I still would. You know what I mean? But, you know, so that's that. So the last thing is that, are we complete on that thought? The last bit I wanted to hit, and then I have to hop off because I have another show in a few minutes and I need to go to the bathroom in between, is like, you're a language expert. What does the word mandate actually mean?
Okay, so I just closed down my browser because I noticed we were having some internet issues. So give me a second to pull up the etymology. Mandate. It says 1500s, Middle French, means a command, a judicial or legal order. From the Latin commission, command, order, literally to give into one's hand in the political sense of approval supposedly conferred by voters to the policies or slogans advocated by winners of an election.
Okay, so I don't know that that helps us at all, but one of the things that I'm noticing everywhere, right, are these signs posted that says, like, you must wear a mask by mandate, right? And there has been zero, to my awareness, legislation passed anywhere, no laws passed, no laws that were actually passed through the regular channels that require people to wear masks. It has all been edicts, orders, and mandates. And my experience with the word mandate until this nonsense was like, you remember when we were at Geo, back to the gymnastics, we'll end full circle here. And in order to move to the next level, you had to score a 35 to mandate it out of that level, right? Remember that? And so, but I knew from the time I was like 10 that mandates were bullshit because I didn't score the 35 and I still passed to the next level. I scored a 34.9 and Fritz still let me move to the next level. So, right, like if it was really like, like he made it, like for a long time it felt like it was that was the rule in USA Gymnastics. No, it was just his little like fiefdom's law. But even he would break his, right? It wasn't really a law, and he knew that.
That's what these are. That is exactly what these are. So I've been in this conversation because we have several lawsuits going here against our governor and our mayor. The mandates are really suggestions. But the problem is that the media is in on the collusion. So the way it happens here is the governor has a mandate. She does not have the legal authority to pass a law. But the press release that went out to the press said that it was, and she did. And then you have the press that doesn't do any investigative reporting anymore, doesn't understand physics, doesn't know what they're talking about, so that now it's being the Los Angeles Times did it.
You can't speak English and you don't know anything about science.
Exactly. So yeah, no, none of these mask mandates are actually legal.
Mm-hmm.
They're just being pushed forth by bullying and PR, and then mostly like by public bullying and ratting and snitching. Mm-hmm.
So
and
we're totally in the brown shirt snitching culture completely now.
A million percent. But it would be amazing if the populace knew that these governors and the mayors don't have the authority and that these aren't laws, but because we no longer have a free press and we're not allowed to gather, how we get this information out without being deplatformed, censored, shadow banned. I'm still inviting that, that solution.
It's just fascinating to me, right, that like, you know, like there's tons and tons and tons of lawyers out there, right? I assume a few of them have differing opinions or a mind that still works, even if they think the virus is real or whatever, that they would have some integrity in their legal, like they would want people to know that they understand the difference between a mandate and a law. So they would say that. But everybody's willing to completely, it's like back to the integrity issue or protecting your intellect or whatever. Like people don't even care. It's not even occurring to people. Like nobody knows what things mean anymore, right? And so there has been no laws.
No, there are no laws passed, and like all these people who are shutting, they don't even actually have to shut down their businesses, and these people are letting go of their businesses that have taken generations to build on total lies. That is what is so frustrating to watch. Is none of this has to be happening on any level if people had like just a modicum of responsibility in looking up the laws and what their rights are, and that's not happening.
It also goes to like, so like one of the things I'm starting to focus in on, right? Like is like, there's been a lot of, it's been going on for a while now. So we have to like look at it from a different angle and re-strategize here, right? And a lot of energy has been put into resistance. And I'm going to start to suggest that more energy be put into ignoring. Right? Like this, there's no law. So I'm just going to ignore what you're saying until you come to me with something that actually means something. I'm just going to ignore. I'm not even going to fight with you. I'm just going to ignore you.
Oh, I've been saying this from the get-go. I'm not resisting anything. I'm standing for justice. Like I'm not at odds with anything. I'm just living my life as a sovereign, law-abiding being. And anyone who thinks different is off their rocker. But unfortunately, that's like 99.9% of the populace who suddenly thinks it's really cool to be a snitch.
Yeah, no, and I feel like that they, whatever people who plan these things, they know that there's going to be a lot of sheep who just go along, and then there's going to be people who waste all their energy resisting, and so they're not actually becoming clever, right? Because they're fighting with every person at the front door of every place, or they're getting into arguments with the people who are telling them to put their mask on, instead of just either ignoring them or like, this is a really fun time to like play with your own personal metaphysics and technology of cloaking and shit like that, right? Like
completely. Completely. Like now is a time to play with sovereignty and being invisible and playing in the other realms. I know you have to go to the bathroom, but I just want to share this with you really quick. I had my first instance of being harassed by another member of the public in a store. This had not happened to me. And I like darted into the produce department because I was already checking out to grab some celery. And this woman goes, "Oh, no mask. What are you, special? What makes you so special?" And she starts following me around the store. I'm saying nothing because I want nothing to do with this. But she goes, "What makes you so special? Are you on mescaline?" And I thought, the fuck would she say? I had just watched Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas 2 or 3 days before. So I was like, this gotta be my own personal simulation. It does not make any. So then I was just like, what game is the multiverse playing with me right now?
There is a ton of that shit happening right now. Like I want to talk about it in a show with Michael One in a couple of weeks, but like literally, like everything we're speaking or doing or whatever is showing up, maybe like in a different way than we meant it when we said it, but it shows right up in your face. Something is obviously paying attention, listening. Something is doing it. I think maybe the more interesting question is it us? Like, are we just
it's us, it's our future selves, and why are we doing that, and what's the bigger picture, and what are we teaching ourselves? Like, why did my future self choose to give me that weirdo experience that wasn't fun?
Right. I mean, I think this is all distraction, and like when you like this is helping us to become focused only on the things we want and stop paying attention to the things we don't want. Like when we let the things we don't like take more of our time than the things we do like that's kind of how the game works, right? So, all right, guys, this is it was going to be a fairly short one, but it was pretty long, and I'm going to get off and take a 5-minute break, and I'll be right back with Strange Mosaic and Masaki Miyagawa. All right, so you can find Dani at DaniCats.com. You guys know where to find me on Facebook at Emily Moyer or TechnoBrat21 at Gmail or on Patreon.com/offplanetmedia. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.